I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an Irregular Warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello, this is Bill, and welcome to yet another episode of Chasing Ghosts, an Irregular Warfare podcast that comes out fortnightly. This episode is episode 37, Storming America, Another War Will Come Home. A few housekeeping notes before we get started with this rather dour and what I think is potentially sad episode, and that would be that I have started something that I call Dispatch, which is an essay series that I do. And in this essay series, in the interregnum of every 2 weeks that I do this, every other week I'll be publishing an essay on an irregular warfare subject or maybe an excursions subject, as I have done in a couple episodes where I don't quite talk to irregular warfare as maybe conventional warfare or what's happening in the current climate. So I would urge you to read the first fictionalized representation of what may be a preamble or a prelude to this very episode, where I fictionalize an account of an attack on America. So I also wanted to shout out to those correspondents who have reached out to me and given me terrific recommendations, terrific conversations about what's going on in the world and what has gone on in the world historically, because of course we all know that if you don't know where you've been, you can't possibly know where you are. And if you want to reach me, it's at cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me, or visit my Chasing Ghosts Substack. So on to the podcast. This podcast, the reason why it's called Storming America, Another War Will Come Home, is because I think in the near term, intermediate future, couldn't really put a timestamp on it. If I was a fortune teller, I wouldn't even be doing this. I'd be investing in the stock market. But nonetheless, I think that war is coming home to America, unfortunately. And this is going to be a war that's not like what happened in 1916, 1917, and 1918, where we had Mexican incursions over the border after the military, the American military, responded to these incursions by actually invading Mexico. This is not going to be the landing of Japanese invasion forces on the Aleutians in the 1940s. This is not going to be the balloons that found their way, Japanese balloons, to the Oregon heartland in the west coast of America during World War II, where Japanese balloon bombs actually detonated and killed Americans on the continental United States. This is not going to be 9/11. This is not going to be any of those things. This is going to be far worse. Now remember, I'm a stickler for language. So in this case, I'm forecasting, I'm not predicting. And forecasting is a lazy way of predicting because the evidentiary basis for forecasts is much less substantive than placing a prediction first and foremost. So if you're not in the mood to listen to what's going to be a dour, sad, and predictably bad news episode about where we live, what's happened to American civilization, the decrepitude of American military arms, and what's in store for us in the future in this retarding apogee of American civilization, where the American empire is probably on the road to crumbling, then I suggest you stop here and go listen to some happy music. So before we get into the details of American martial, military, and political ineptitude and decrepitude that is here today, I wanted to at least find adjacent to irregular warfare. And for those listeners who have been listening to me from episode 1, I wanted to cover a little bit of what makes this germane and cognizant to the general tone and inquiries that we've made since I first started this podcast series. And that would be the fact that under irregular warfare as a rubric, we have unconventional warfare, we have counter-guerrilla, we have guerrilla warfare, we have counterinsurgency, insurgency, terrorism, cyber warfare, and then we have this curious notion that's referred to as hybrid and gray zone warfare. And you can find all kinds of literature out there that can cover this in a detail that would not be germane to this episode series, nor something you'd want to listen to for hours on end. But if those of you who are interested in getting a more detailed and nuanced assessment of not only the left and right limits of gray zone and hybrid warfare, of which the Russians remain the king in certain respects, while the Chinese remain the king when it comes to the exercise of soft power, I would urge you to find those out. So what's gray zone warfare? If the ever-increasing changes in the characteristics of contemporary warfare, they've complicated the security environment, and all of this, of course, in the 21st century, but all of this is an antecedent and a follow-on to all the wars that were fought over the 20th century after World War I broke the peace that had been in place almost planet-wide for 100 years. Now, modern warfare inclines toward non-kinetic dimensions based on the principles of hybridity, soft power, and ambiguity, as I mentioned before. This changing nature of warfare has been defined and categorized in diverse ways. There's a lot of disagreement within the irregular warfare intellectual community and the war community, both the formal professional military education community that you find in the West, primarily in the United States with the war colleges and everything else, and the terms hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare, unrestricted warfare, which was authored by two Chinese gentlemen in the late 90s. I would urge you to find that book and read it if you get a chance. And they even have something called ambiguous warfare. They've received a lot of attention in recent years. And a key contemporary challenge is to differentiate between war and peace, because gray zone warfare occupies the space in between both of these situations. So many contemporary conflicts are neither black nor white. Instead, they fall in the middle of the two, this gray zone that we're talking about. These factors underscore the significance of evaluating and understanding this concept of gray zone warfare. The U.S. considers Russia, China, and Iran as revisionist states, in quotes, that employ gray zone warfare in various domains to challenge the U.S. and the coalition forces and the allied forces in the West. So that gives us the definitional constraints of what the heck this has to do with irregular warfare. But nonetheless, we're going to go into possibly excursions territory, maybe even make this a hybrid episode, as it were, where we discuss both irregular warfare, recent history, and, as I mentioned, the decrepitude of the American imperial war machine. There are a number of pratfalls and dangers of using history not only as a bloodless practicum for the military historian when he looks back 2,000, 3,000 years, and all of the things that we can learn that we can apply today, a lot of them are so timeless. But there's also a trap where one can say, well, when this happened in the past, and I'll be discussing the fall of France and the Battle of France from 10 May through 25 June 1940, and why I think there are eerie echoes and implications from the fall of France to what I suspect may just happen to America in the near to intermediate future, and also what happened at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and what happened with capital investments and how that was turned on its head by what happened in the Pacific at the time. I'm going to take those two elements, we're going to chat about them a little bit, and then we're going to extrapolate from those two elements to present 21st century America and the West and see what we can tease out as far as parallels. And mind you, I am not claiming that by looking at that, it gives us a template to either shift our course, reify our course, or change our course completely in the West to avoid what I suspect is going to be a series of calamities, what I like to call a chaos avalanche in the West, that's going to cause us to blink when the dust settles, look around, and find that we are in a whole new world. So before I discuss those historical analogs that I just mentioned, I wanted to talk about my phraseology of the military decrepitude of America and the West. When we look at the fact that, as I have said in previous podcasts, the United States hasn't won a conflict since 1945. We've had a number of ignoble defeats, stalemates, places that have been abandoned after too many casualties were sustained, or it became unsustainable for the Treasury to continue the conflict that was being fought. In a previous episode, I had discussed the fact that when you put so much blood and treasure into carrier forces, for instance, which have a diminishing return on that fabulously huge investment over time in the 21st century, one would think we'd go back to the drawing board. When you look at the recruiting shortfalls across the board, when you look at the fact that with a 1 to 12 tooth-to-tail ratio, and what this means is that for every trigger puller that's out there in the military, primarily in this case, if we're talking about infantrymen in the Marines and the U.S. Army, what that means is that out of a force of 500,000, we can make a guarded estimate that maybe, just maybe, we've got 50,000 trigger pullers, and then that 1 to 12 tooth-to-tail ratio means that the logistical chain behind it to sustain that soldier in the field is enormous, especially in the framework of the expeditionary-style warfare that the U.S. and the West have been conducting since the beginning of the 20th century. But aside from those manning shortfalls that we have in the armed forces, and these manning shortfalls, by the way, are finding themselves made evident in the NATO countries and Europe. For instance, we have the smallest army in the UK's history, possibly, where they would have a hard time fielding a division outside of the UK proper. Let's call a division, for accounting purposes, approximately 10 to 12,000 men. They would have a hard time projecting that. Their Navy in the UK is a disaster. They have less than 35 capital warships. They now have 2 non-nuclear carriers that are fielding the F-35 Bravo and Charlie. And not only is that airframe a particularly costly and ineffective airframe with reduced combat radiuses, but it has been discovered, and this goes back to 2017 with drivetrain issues for both of these carriers, they simply cannot leave the littoral areas of the United Kingdom proper without breaking down. And then they limp their way home to find out what the heck is wrong with those particular ships. Now, mind you, that means that they don't have the ability to project power. But again, it doesn't really matter to me too much as far as the lethality or the effectiveness of their fighting power, because as you know, I think that at the margin, the carrier is an anachronism, and it is something that many countries have an ambition for. The United States maintains it, but I think for the money that's invested and the treasure invested in it, especially in this time of unmanned modalities that are going from mud to space and that are changing the nature and tenor of warfare in the 21st century, it really is not money well spent, nor effort well put together to pursue these things. There has been a debate in military circles and among military history enthusiasts on what is the nature of the forces today and what is it going to look like for the West to actually fight. And what we've discovered in what I find an astonishingly short-sighted methodology of supplying Ukraine, for instance, with all the arms and tactics, techniques, and procedures and training and equipment and materiel and all the rest, is that for the first time in the 21st century, what we have is we have a peer-near-peer conflict. The peer in this case being Russia, the near-peer being the Ukraine. The Ukraine is supported by the West. The Ukraine has emptied many of the magazine inventories in the West, primarily in the United States, causing a bunch of logistical problems that are going to haunt the U.S. if it gets involved in a near-peer and peer fight in the future. But the other thing that's rather interesting about all of that is that I do talk about the decrepitude of U.S. forces, of Western forces, armed forces, and such, and to have on full display in this warfighting laboratory, as I mentioned, the first near-peer-peer conflict, maybe we could call it 50, 60 years, that's occurring in the Ukrainian-Russian special military operation conducted by the Russians themselves. The Russians have been taking notes. The Russians have a warfighting laboratory. We've seen in the 24 months plus that not only has the Russian strike reconnaissance complex, and the West has nothing to match that kind of fires and synchronization that they are able to conduct as a regional hegemon. And there are other reasons that I'll cover in future episodes on why being a global hegemon will never allow you to synchronize fires the way these regional hegemons like China and Russia can from a military standpoint, is that we have the opportunity here to take notes ourselves. I hope that we're doing that, but what we're seeing with the Russians, who are actually involved in the fight, is that not only are they doing well because they've essentially defeated 3 Ukrainian armies. Now, by the way, if I landed here from Mars in the past year, and all I did was I tuned into mainstream and corporate news sources in the West, I would not come to that conclusion. I would come to the conclusion that the Russians are on the ropes, they're having a tough time, and that the Ukrainians will be marching on Moscow. It's just a matter of time. I've mentioned before, as a professional and amateur observer of conflict, my entire adult life, I have never seen a conflict like this between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which is turning into a broader conflict, unfortunately, where I don't have a good idea with the information that's available to me to instantiate a reliable, single most accurate picture of what the heck is going on, because there is so much media manipulation going on with the coverage of this conflict. This decrepitude, engineering catastrophes, lack of martial imagination, the whole works is starting to become what I would call, from an anti-fragile perspective, a real crisis in the offing at an existential level. I have made the case in the past that when it comes to human conflict and warfare, what you're seeing is 2 very complex, adaptive systems colliding with each other, whether it's 2 opponents, whether it's 2 or more opponents, maybe it's coalitions against coalitions. It is always going to be the least incompetent army that will win the war. For a variety of reasons, the U.S. and the West do not have the general officer talent. They don't have the operational and strategic martial talent. They don't have the equipment across the board, whatever it may be, from tanks to IFVs to aircraft and all the rest. For instance, big fan of the A-10. I was in Afghanistan and I got to see them in action several times. Glorious aircraft. And in this case, we were fighting indigenous Afghans, and in Iraq, fighting indigenous Iraqis. And those aircraft could come in handy in an environment in which you essentially, because these are 3rd world and developing countries, you had what would be referred to in the past as air dominance, air superiority, air supremacy. Those 3 instantiations of aerial dominance will not exist in the future in a near peer and peer fight. Now, we examine the A-10, which I think is an extraordinary aircraft, probably one of the big success stories from an aircraft acquisition, employment, and effectiveness decision cycle at the end of the 20th century. Around the early 1980s is when it started to be fielded. Extraordinary aircraft. But like the Su-25 Frogfoot, which is the Russian analog to the A-10 as a ground attack aircraft, in near peer and peer fighting, the A-10 will be shot from the sky inevitably by the droves. So it simply has seen its day, much as my contention with carriers, much as my contention with our obsession with technological superiority. Which takes me back to a book that I would recommend everybody read. Actually, it's a short story by Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction author. I think he wrote it in 1951 or 1952. It's called Superiority. It's all about this galactic battle. By the way, I love the way fiction can frame these things in a way that makes it palatable and not as politically assailable as trying to marshal one's facts and evidence to make these positions known. In the short story, the galactic antagonists find themselves going head-to-head in this conflict that has lasted for decades. And on one side, you have this technological combine that's extraordinary across worlds, in which they make the finest and most exquisite machines and technological marvels that one can do, and their foes aren't doing that so much. They are doing things that are much simpler, things that may not have the technological shine and savvy of what the other antagonists are using. But ultimately, the antagonists with the superior technology lose to the fact that not only does quantity have a quality of its own, but the reliability of less complex systems in the collision of complex adaptive systems that we call warfare can save the day and actually win the day. That is a component of what's going on with the West as we speak. And I'm not one of those chaps who's going to say, well, there's this one thing, root causes, proximate causes. In engineering, we have root causes and proximate causes. Well, those root causes and proximate causes obviously tend to be decomposed in a fashion where you can discover, well, what if we conducted a failure analysis here, what causes? And you'll always find that there's a chain of events that informs these failures. Now, I had mentioned previously about Russian dominance in arms in the Ukraine, and I also mentioned that we're seeing a live laboratory where, for those sober observers, like Colonel McGregor, for instance, who I urge you to listen to if you get an opportunity, he's observed, and I'm paraphrasing here, that you have them learning on the run, learning in the fight, and learning how to do things better, in this case, the Russians. There has been this hubris and this assumption on the part of the U.S. and Western war colleges especially to really diminish the Russian way of war, to really diminish the way the Soviets fought, for instance. Yet, and I cover this when I give a tutorial every year at a national conference where I talk about fragility and the future of fragility, anti-fragility, and the future of conflict and how it's employed in systems engineering. And what you discover is that I make the point that from 1941 to 1943, when the Russians were invaded by the Germans, and as you know, thank you, David Stahel, the author of some of the best books on the German campaigns into Russia under Barbarossa. The Germans lost in the summer of 1941, took them 4 years to die. But we saw the Russians just going back and back and back and playing for time, playing for space. And eventually, from 1943 to 1945, there is a wholesale about-face and a reconstruction from the ground up of how the Russian forces wage war, and they do it extraordinarily well, which of course leads them to entering Berlin as the victors in the early spring of 1945, after 4 years of conflict with the Germans. I bring that to your attention because it seems that, unfortunately, because I do wish that we could simply talk, but apparently talking is not in the cards, the West seems pell-mell on a collision warfare and all the rest of it with Russia, by extension China, and all the BRICS nations that have reoriented themselves in this 21st century realignment and rapprochement between these previous nation states that didn't necessarily see eye to eye, but the West has forced the function for them. Despite all the happy talk, despite all the intellectual investments from the advocacy tanks, those aren't think tanks, by the way, from the advocacy tanks, painting this rosy and happy days picture of the U.S. being able finally not only to best Napoleon's failures, not only to best Hitler's failures, but that in a day or a month or just a little bit of time, U.S. and Western forces will march into Moscow and take over, or maybe even Beijing, or whatever the case may be, and all days will be happy after that. That is not the future for American arms nor Western arms. It is much dimmer than that. So, if you don't know where you've been, you can't possibly know where you are. So what am I getting at? What I'm getting at here is two observations from a very narrow period of time, which is 2 years, 1940 and 1941. We're going to start with 1941, which means that on December 7th, 1941, wherever you may be and whether FDR pushed the Japanese into that attack, the Japanese wanted to do that to give themselves cover for their Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere and the centrifugal strategy that they had in the next 3 months to literally take the U.S., the French, the Dutch, and the British out of the game in Southeast Asia and make that literally a Japanese lake. Well, they succeeded through March 1942. Now, on December 7th, when all those battleships were lost, the United States did actually have the first carriers. We did have a fairly good carrier aviation capability, but nothing to match not only the technology, but the training and the procedural engagements and the operational and strategic modalities that Japanese naval aviation employed to do what they did with so much success in those 4 months from December 1941 to the denouement of the Indonesian campaign in March of 1942, and everything in between in those 4 months. And on December 7th, what it proved out is that all the tens of billions of dollars, let's say that was contemporary inflation-adjusted dollars for today, echoing back to 1940 and all the rest, every one of those battleships, for the most part, to include the Japanese mass investments in battleships, were a moot point. With the Savage sinking exclusively by Japanese naval aviation in December of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, two capital ships by the British that they had sent into Southeast Asia to fly the British flag and protect their falling colonies there, it marked a new day. And all of a sudden, everybody had to go back to the drawing board. Now, mind you, because of what America was back then, which is not what America is today, America had, along with the West, but primarily America, had this tremendous manufacturing base in material, and also the sustained infrastructure nationwide across the United States to actually build things, which we don't have today. We had the manpower back then to actually fabricate things, build things, design things. Designing aircraft, it's wartime, designing aircraft, tanks, fighting machines, artillery, and things in that brief 4-year interregnum in which the United States was involved in that, where we saw this technological splendor blossoming across the entire infrastructure of the United States in the landscape of engineering and such, and it led us to victory, along with the Russians, because we all know that World War II would not defeat the Germans and the Japanese without Russian help. So despite the happy face that I put on American technology, engineering, aircraft development, fighting vehicle development, artillery development, and all the rest, not to mention the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb, in all of those things, I want to use that as a contrast to the development and effectiveness desert that is American military technology for the last 50 years, to include, with the nuclear saber rattling going on as we speak, the sclerotic, arthritic, and again, I'll use that term, decrepit, inventory of nuclear arms that the West has. For instance, if my reading is correct, America hasn't detonated a nuclear warhead since 1992. America hasn't updated, for the most part, its nuclear arsenal, whether airborne or missileers or the ballistic missile submarines and such, for the longest time. We don't have a good reliability factor for, well, if a nuclear war is conducted, and the gods help us, I hope this never comes to pass, but I am just shocked and amazed at the way the West hasn't taken that off the table. It gives me nightmares thinking of what Truman promised in 1950 and 1951, where he said, we haven't taken nuclear weapons off the table in the conduct of the war against the North Koreans on the Korean Peninsula. Is that when we look at this, well, if you do that, do we have the capability to send those aloft reliably? In the past 3 weeks, we have seen not only the Germans launching 2 missiles that failed to launch, but even the either experimental or training launch of a Trident missile by the British that failed. All 3 of these have failed. Nonetheless, we can talk for hours not only of the lack of martial imagination in the past 50 years on the part of the U.S. and its Western allies, but also just the shabbiness of the entire defense industry in having complex systems. In this case, it could be everything from tanks to missiles to aircraft to ships, and the fact that we don't seem to be able to do that. So I wanted to bookend that with something else, and that's this. So I've talked about Pearl Harbor and battleships, and why, from a technological perspective, not only are we not there, but that is a factor in warfighting, of course. Now I want to talk to you about the Battle of France. 10 May to 25 June 1940, also known as the Western Campaign, what the Germans called the Westfeldzug, the French campaign, which was the Frankreichsschuld, and the Campaign de France. This is the fall of France. I repeat those dates, 10 May to 25 June. In this case, France had one of the largest militaries on planet Earth, and a large part of that military just so happened to be in France proper, along with its colonial holdings in Indochina and Africa. They had something called the Maginot Line, built in the 1930s. It was this, and I urge all of my listeners to go take a look at the machinations of the Maginot Line and what it was all about. But imagine, if you would, a series of fortresses that are butted together, that extends along hundreds of miles, that is staffed by French soldiers, I think on the order of over 1 million. And I know that I remember seeing something where it read that 200,000 of those soldiers would be exposed to artificial light because they never left the Maginot Line fortresses for weeks or months at a time and lived in that fashion, because they had all hearkened back to World War I and said, in that battle of attrition and not maneuver, we're going to be able to best whatever foe goes against us, because we learned the lessons of World War I, which we all know weren't the lessons of World War II, because the lessons of World War II were about maneuver. Now, of course, the most brilliant maneuver forces on Earth at the time, as far as land powers were concerned, were the Germans. I also think that in the Pacific, the most brilliant maneuver warfare specialists when it came to aviation until 1943 were the Japanese. But in this case, what we have is we have an extension of this Maginot Line where it goes down and it sort of parks itself and it attaches itself to the Ardennes forest, and we all know what the Ardennes is. That's where the Battle of the Bulge took place in December 1945, where the Germans didn't find it as impenetrable as the Allies did in 1945, and they certainly didn't find it as impenetrable as the French thought it would be in 1940. The Germans, in the end, did an end run around it, and they took out one of the largest armies on Earth at the time in less than 60 days. So I want to read from Ernest May's book concerning the fall of France, and then we're going to talk about why that is relevant to the discussions we're having today about America and the West's fate and warfare in the 21st century. The book is Ernest May's book, which I recommend everybody have in their library if you're interested. Ernest R. May, Strange Victory, Hitler's Conquest of France. I wanted to read a couple selections out of here, and then I'll tie it into why it has to do with today's subject matter in the episode. So, in sum, quote, in sum, the essential thread in the story of Germany's victory over France hangs on the imaginativeness of German war planning and the corresponding lack of imaginativeness on the Allied side. Hitler and his generals perceived that the weakness of their otherwise powerful enemies resided in habits and routines that made their reaction time slow. They developed a plan that capitalized on this weakness. French and British leaders made no effort to understand how or why German thinking might differ from theirs. They neglected to prepare for the possibility of surprise, and as German analysts and planners predicted, they could not react properly once events began to be at odds with expectation. Mercifully for humankind, the German advantage did not persist. After the miracle in France, Hitler became so sure of his own genius that he ceased to test his judgments against those of others, and his generals virtually ceased to challenge him. His conduct of the Battle of Britain, his invasion of the Soviet Union under Barbarossa, and his subsequent declaration of war on the U.S. were, to say the least, ill-considered. But up through the victory over France in 1940, The story contrasts the exercise on the German side of some common sense and the failure on the Allied side to exercise any common sense, end of quote. And what you have here, if we fast forward to the 21st century, is that when you saw that French resistance to new thinking, that French allegiance to World War I thinking, and thinking that this second and third generation bifurcation in warfare, which means that it's either attrition warfare or it's maneuver warfare, which is third generation warfare. Fourth generation warfare, for those listeners who have hung on through previous episodes, happens to be most of the things that I cover in this podcast series when it comes to irregular warfare. And another thing that I'd like you to keep in mind with this thinking is that there are these notions of nonlinear and linear. And there's this notion that warfare is very linear. Now, I'll give you that it is, but I'll also give you that it's nonlinear, because what happens with warfare for the most part is that it is out of control of the planners once the war starts in earnest and things don't go as they were predicted to go by either side that is fighting. One more quote from May that is so germane to what we're talking about today. He says, "This is said to underline the primary moral that emerges from the story of Germany and France in 1938 to 1940. The importance of operational common sense. In the management of conflict, the key differences between the German government and the French and British governments up through mid-1940 were procedural. In the German government, the question, what is going on, was repeatedly re-examined in light of changing answers to the questions, so what, and what is to be done. In the French and British governments prior to June 1940, this did not occur. Leaders did not state their presumptions or expose them to debate. They made choices and then either blinkered themselves against questions or invented answers to the question, what is going on, in order to fortify their preferred answers to the question, what is to be done. The first was the case with Gamelin. When failing to review the premises of the Dial-Breda plan, the second with Daladier, when he became an advocate of winning the war with Germany by going to war with the Soviet Union, and with Renault and Churchill when they championed opening new theaters of war in Scandinavia and the Balkans." End of quote. Now, what that tells you is that these were clearly failures of imagination, to awkwardly paraphrase a failure to communicate. He goes on, quote, "To conclude with a question that is almost a precept, I borrow from Oliver Cromwell, this is May, Britain's Lord Protector when the Puritans held control during the Civil War in the 17th century. However dimly remembered, the story of Germany's defeat of France in 1940 ought to bring to mind Cromwell's injunction in 1650 to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken." End of quote. We are in an existential crisis in the U.S. and West when it comes to posing and framing the correct questions about conflict in the future, especially when it comes to the next 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, 5 years. For some reason, instead of talking, instead of peace talks, instead of granting regional hegemony to the Chinese and the Russians, and simply saying live and let live, the swords have been drawn and the chest beating taking place in the West with a Western military establishment that isn't ready for this. Now, mind you, it isn't ready for the conventional war, it isn't ready for the nuclear war, which brings us to the meat of what we're talking about today. The point that I'm making is that through gray zone and hybrid warfare and what we've just recently seen with the October 7th, 2023 Hamas et al. Attack from Gaza into Israel proper, and what that has done to reshape, for those who are paying attention, how war is going to be fought in the future. I am not saying that conventional wars won't occur. I'm not saying that nuclear wars won't occur. What I'm saying is that you are going to have bundles of TTP and operational precepts, in this case, gray zone and hybrid warfare, that are going to cause a lot of trouble in the respective homelands in the West. And of course, I need to go back to probably patient zero in the 20th century, maybe even one could say in the late 19th century, of what would be political violence and terrorism less than war. And that is a quote from Vladimir Lenin, where he says, "No dictatorship of the proletariat is to be thought of without terror and violence." End of quote. That is the future that is just around the corner. I'd mentioned earlier, considering the fact that with two oceans abutting against the respective east and west coasts of the United States, rarely has there been any kind of conventional conflict conducted on the U.S. mainland. We would have to harken back to 1812 to 1814 with the British invasions, and maybe one can say concomitantly the Canadian invasions of the Atlantic seaboard at the time, and what that caused. And then, of course, after 1814-15, and those unpleasantries are resolved in London, and the British go back to Canada, and they go back to England proper, no other such conventional conflict has taken place. But I did mention what happened during World War I at the Mexican border. I did mention what happened in the Aleutians with the Japanese invasion. I did mention a number of terrorist episodes that have happened on U.S. soil by foreign interlocutors, such as 9/11 and a few others. Nothing on a conventional scale. In this case, I just got finished reading Kurt Schlichter's tremendous book called The Attack. And what Kurt did with that book was he sort of did a World War Z Max Brooks treatment of a Gaza-style attack into Israel, expanded and upnumbered and upgunned for a contemporary attack into the American homeland. In this case, approximately 10,000 young Islamic soldiers in teams of 5 who over a 3-day period of time would hit first public places, second day residential homes, third day grid and infrastructure. Now, he puts it together in a really amusing fashion, and it's serious business, and he does a really good job drawing from a panoply of perspectives on everything from anchors to PJs to ordinary folk, both rural and urban, and their reactions to this instantiated plan of attack on the American homeland. Now, number one has to know a lot of planning has to go into that. That's correct. One has to know, too, that it doesn't take a lot of money to make this happen. And number 3, and again, I don't want to take a stand either way on the immigration question because that's outside the purview and scope of this podcast. But nonetheless, when you have a border at the south that the numbers are between 6, 8, 10 million, I don't think anybody really knows how many illegals have come in above and apart from those instantly granted asylum and given a piece of paper and said to report to the following immigration court in 5 years. Those are the ones that are actually seeking asylum, have interaction with the U.S. Border Patrol or whatever federal agency or maybe even a state agency or local agencies that are at that 1,800-mile border in the southern United States. We don't know how many of those folks have come over who didn't get asylum. They just came over and penetrated and fell into various networks that were already here. It has been alleged that the Iranians have, and I think the Russians also, and I think the Chinese, have a number of very sophisticated sleeper cell networks. They have what's called in the intelligence parlance NOCs, which are non-official cover, and those would be the folks who are here clandestinely instead of covertly. Because one of the distinctions here is that there has been this almost Marcus and Kingsbury rules when it comes to espionage, where there's respect for covert attaches and such at various embassies, and they will treat them with kid gloves. The NOCs, not so much. A good example of a NOC was the trade that we have with Gary Powers in 1962, where you had a KGB colonel in the United States who was traded for Gary Powers on that bridge from that Tom Hanks movie, if you guys are familiar. And he was a non-official cover. He was a guy over here in a Russian sleeper cell, in that case, a Soviet sleeper cell for the KGB to be activated in wartime. The infrastructure problems that we have in the United States as far as the admission of immigrants and such, and then, of course, our grid infrastructure, the fragility of the energy infrastructure, the fragility of the energy transmission infrastructure, the fragility of the security in public spaces, public malls, things like that, all leaves a lot to be desired from a security perspective. But then again, we see what happened in October 7th, 2023, with the Gazan invasion of Israel on the border, where despite the fact that the storied and legendary Israeli Defense Forces and Mossad and Shin Bet, an intelligence community, in concert with the mud-to-space intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance infrastructures that they had, and they had all the volunteers in a lawn chair of the 60, 70, 80-year-old Israeli leatherettes, man and woman, who are there with a radio or a phone watching the border. And all of that failed for some reason on probably one of the most secure borders on planet Earth. So Kurt Schlichter took up that baton, as it were, and said, I'm going to write a fictional account. And I love the fact that that fiction was used to do this, because I think that fiction, along with science fiction, along with speculative fiction, can do so much to sort of knock people upside the head when it comes to changing their paradigmatic vision of how they think the world works and how it actually works. And in this case, with The Attack, that's the title. I urge you guys to go out there, get the book, read it. It's a quick read. It's an amusing read. It's a dour read. It's a sad read. And the kind of stuff that you see in there it may give you waking nightmares for the rest of your life. As a matter of fact, it harkens back, and I don't see Kurt Schlichter mentioning this, but William Fortune, who wrote 1 Second After, that I've mentioned previously in this podcast, speaking of grid infrastructure, fragility, and vulnerability, in which an EMP device, an electromagnetic pulse device, is detonated over the respective coasts of America, and America is shut down, where it simply can't function anymore because all the IC circuits, all the transmission circuits, all the transistor circuits, all of them have been overpowered and burned out. When I first read the book several years ago, and I think it was Fortune who even inspired the U.S. Congress to finally get off their keisters and actually do an EMP examination of the vulnerabilities of the grid. And there was a 2010 report that was released on that. That is, I think, required reading for anybody interested in that very notion. He said, hey, there's going to be a 95% die-off, according to his calculations in the speculative fiction book. And I thought, oh, that's outrageous. 95% of Americans dying in the first year after an EMP explosion that devastates the grid infrastructure. We'd simply go back to 19th century farming techniques, 18th century farming techniques, and build from there. Not to mention the fact that as a civilization, we're not starting from scratch. We've got all these libraries, and I know that the digits will be destroyed, but we've got all these hardbound book libraries that will be available for us to restart, recalibrate civilization and build it. But by the end of the book, by reading the 2010 report, by looking at how fragile the medical infrastructure is, how drugs and refrigeration and HVAC has made parts of America, for instance, I just moved from Arizona to Florida, it would be almost impossible for modern Americans to live in an unair-conditioned Arizona, probably Southern California. Here in Florida, we have our own challenges. Our entire infrastructure in the United States is built on transportation. It is built on just-in-time inventories. It is built on the ability to go out to your garage or your carport or your driveway, get in your car and go where you need to go, whether you're going to eat or go play a sport or whatever the case may be. All of that would be destroyed in an EMP. So this same man, William Fortune, wrote a book called Day of Wrath, in which, and I would characterize it as a novella because it's rather short, and again, I commend that to your attention. It makes a great accompaniment to The Attack, Kurt Schlichter's book. You can either read it before or after. I would recommend you read it before Schlichter's book because I think he puts a little more depth into his perspective. And in Fortune's book, there are several thousand Islamic extremists and what you could call guerrillas who come into America and they start to lay waste spontaneously and on the same day and at the same hour on a variety of target sets that they also change. For instance, unlike Schlichter's book, in which the first day targeting is public places, second day targeting is residential areas, third day targeting is infrastructure and grid. And by the way, Schlichter, of course, he's a conservative commentator, and I do find that there's a lot of things he says that I agree with. And he also thinks that the ineptitude and sheer incompetence of government would inform what their reaction to this would be. And in this case, of course, once all the public places are attacked on the first day, all available forces are deployed to public places, and then the residential attack takes place. On the second day, at the conclusion, as a result of the residential, all of those forces that were used to protect public places go to residential areas. But on the third day of the attack, with the original planners outside of America, they're attacking infrastructure and grid, and those aren't protected. So I think it was what we would call here at the podcast a cavalcade of calamities, or my favorite phraseology of late, a chaos avalanche, which is certainly the case. In this case, what Fortune's book did is these teams, and the magnitude of numbers of his teams is less than the ambitious numbers of approximately 10,000 that Schlichter says are activated on 0 days to start the attacks in America that are very much the style of the October 7th, 2023 attacks. In this case, what they do is they attack elementary schools, they attack middle schools, and they go in there and they do the most savage things. And of course, parents are reacting by driving there. Extrapolating that parents and authorities would be driving there, then they start to take out highway arterials and go on highway arterials and shoot into cars, cause cars to have collisions and such. And then they just march through these long lines of crashed and stalled vehicles and start really increasing the body count of innocent Americans who are either on their way to work that day, on their way to pick up their children, whatever the case may be. Both of these are extraordinarily chilling accounts of how to make this happen and how it could be done. And the thing that's very disturbing about all of this from a hybrid gray zone, hybrid warfare perspective is that we're talking very low-cost events. We're talking, let's see, an F-35 costs about $100 million. If you took, and all we're doing here, this is a swag, we're throwing a marker on the wall. If you took $10 million and you wanted to fund 10,000 folks over 24 months to come into America, instantiate themselves with existing sleeper cells, establish new sleeper cells, and just wait and establish yourself in a cellular structure so that, for instance, what Schlichter talks about in this case is that you have these cellular structures out there where you have one team leader for a 5-man team, and there's one team leader for 25 teams, and they don't talk to each other. And the elegant, if awful, reality of launching these teams is that, number one, you're launching these teams and they're fire and forget. They don't have to be managed or led because they just go in there to maximize the carnage that they're going to cause and the dysfunction that they're going to cause. And every man on the team knows that they are going to die, and that is the way it's going to work out. If every man on the team is going to die, then it really calls into question the conventional hostage rescue techniques and hostage situational techniques of negotiation and such, because what Schlichter emphasizes in there and Fortune hinted at is that you can come there and set up that perimeter around a school or a residential dwelling or a shopping mall, and you could start talking to a guy, and they would probably inform these, in this case, Islamic extremists in both books that would be the militants to conduct this in the American homeland. They're playing for time and they're talking, but at the same time that they're talking and that a breach hasn't been conducted by the American forces, they're in there doing their morbid worst to whoever they have in their charge. So I urge you to read both of these books. Two other book recommendations that I have that sort of speak to the disproportionate advantage of singletons or small teams and putting them over the border and into a country and sleeper cells and such is The Wasp by Eric Frank Russell, that talks about, in a science fiction way, how one man is sent to a planet to wreak havoc on it. Same thing with The Weapon and the entire Freehold series that Michael Z. Williamson wrote. Both these books are tremendous adjuncts and complement really well what Schlichter and Fortune tried to do in both of those books. I wish that Schlichter's book and Fortune's book could be required reading for all policymakers, politicians in the U.S. and the West and such, but I simply don't think that they would think they have the time nor the imaginary predisposition to take that on. So here comes the worst news of all of this. America in the West, but America in particular, the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security, they don't do defense. Clearly, they don't do defense. I've spoken in previous episodes of our inability to establish a corridor of air defense against incoming aerial munitions, even space munitions, on the West Coast or even the East Coast of America that would match anything like what the Russians and especially the Chinese have organized in their anti-air area denial access paradigms that they've put on their borders. They actually protect their borders. Now, mind you, with Schlichter and Fortune, none of this could have happened unless there is a porous border through which all of these folks could come through over months, over years, and establish themselves and wait. In the past 36 months, there has been an unprecedented number of not only asylum seekers, but undocumented folks who went around that, did not get that piece of paper that said, come back to an immigration court in 5, 6, 7 years and do what you have to do. These are folks, among whom are not always Mexican interlopers who come over the border, but a variety of folks, and you can go online and do all your own research as far as who that is and what kind of folks are coming across. A lot of single military-age males up to the age of 35 are coming in. I remember the chilling portrayal in the news of that one gentleman who they stopped at the border and they said, hey, what's going on? What are you doing? Because clearly he was of Middle Eastern origin. And he was saying, just wait, you'll see what happens. And it turns out that he was on a terrorism watch list. I don't know what's transpired and what's happened as far as that, but I think that is the tip of the iceberg of where we're at. So to wrap up these geopolitical prognostications and put a bow on it, what I've always done in this podcast is not only speak to the, this word decrepitude is such a great descriptor of everything going on in the Marshall West, not only of the unconventional fights and the unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency and such, and the absolute incompetence, if not malicious neglect that has occurred where American arms, and by extension Western arms, simply haven't done well in any of these very unconventional campaigns. Now, on the conventional front, as we're seeing again and again, and the indicators are very disturbing, we may not have in the U.S. and the West the capability to conduct the conflict that we seem to be writing checks for in the Ukraine and greater NATO, for instance. So there's 3 legs to this stool. The first leg is the lack of adequacy in the fielding and conduct of conventional warfare. Second leg, the lack of adequacy and effectiveness in the conduct of counterinsurgency, insurgency, unconventional warfare, and everything that we would characterize as irregular warfare. And number 3, the third leg, and probably most importantly, as far as return on investment for an antagonist who would choose to employ an internal military stratagem that would reflect by orders of magnitude greater numbers than the October 7th, 2023 invasion from Gaza with irregular forces into Israel proper in all Western nations, not simply the United States. I've concentrated on the United States because this is where we live. For those of my listeners who happen to be in Europe, you're in worse trouble than us. But that being the case, that third leg is the worst case scenario harnessed to the immigration difficulties that America has suffered, and not simply in the last 3 years, but in the last few decades. That kind of influx of folks and the peopling and quantitative roundup of sleeper cells, non-official cover, any cells that are attached, whether they're attached to Islam, or they could be attached to China, or they could be attached to Russia. I mean, one of the largest foreign service intelligence penetrations in the United States happens to be that of Israel, who conduct a lot of corporate espionage and other kinds of espionage of military intelligence and such that is germane to their security infrastructure within Israel proper. The Chinese conduct both soft power and corporate espionage. The Russians, certainly, I would think that historically they've done the same thing. But I think the largest threat to the U.S. and the West is going to be this Islamic influx, especially if there is a rapprochement, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, between Sunni and Shia religionist sects in Islam, and the calling up of these forces either in reaction to a U.S. military incursion overseas or the starting of a conflict and the opening up of a third front here in America. So per this discussion, I'd like all of you to pause and reflect and take time to step away from the radio or whatever podcast venue you're employing to listen to my bloviations, and just close your eyes and think about what's going on. And think about the fact that I contend we are in the very same place as the French were at in 1940 when it comes to conventional conflict, and that what happened with the technological wonders that were battleships before December 7th, 1941, everybody in the West, pretty much planet-wide, remember the Japanese built 3 super battleships, everybody was convinced that that was the way. That was dashed in 4 months from December 1941 to March 1942 by Japanese naval aviation, which changed the whole color and tenor of warfare for the remainder of human history from that point forward. And of course, we have what happened with the Germans in their land battles with the Russians, and we see what the Russians did as far as their 1943, 1945, just absolutely astounding turnaround in the annals of human warfare and conflict to do what they did. This course can't be corrected in days, weeks, months, maybe even years. But what's going to happen, and inevitably, the sad news here is I think that there is a certain inevitability to this third violent front being opened up in the United States. And by the way, I'm speaking purely from the instance of foreign sleeper cells, because one thing that Schlichter disturbingly teases out in his book is that college campuses, which are the orchid house and root vegetable for all notions of communism as an ideology in the United States, they take up arms with the Islamist interlopers to participate in the bloodshed of their fellow Americans. I'm not even forecasting or predicting that that very thing would happen. But if it were to pass, that would be yet another permutation on this very sticky, wicked problem of an internal violence front being opened within the United States proper. So I feel as if in this podcast, I've sort of covered a 101 of why America is on a martial and military precipice from which it may never recover conventionally and from an unconventional perspective, and from the fact that for all the trillions of dollars that have been expended by America in the West in military efficacy, effectiveness, arms, and expeditionary frameworks and all of this, hardly anything has been devoted to what would happen if all of a sudden tomorrow morning my listeners and I wake up to turn on the radio, and in some cases Schlichter had said that comms would be affected, but we turn on the radio and discover that simultaneously across the entire nation, terror cells have been rising up, and they're not there to negotiate or do any of that. They're rising up just to cause carnage and infrastructure damage. As chilling and worrisome it is to even speak to that or even imagine that that could happen, If we don't assume the worst case scenarios, then we simply can't be configured or anticipating what we need to do to protect ourselves. So the number one thing that I would ask my listeners to do is think about this, talk about it with friends and family, and put in place some measures that you could do and imagine war game, as it were. What would happen to protect your friends, family, business associates, business networks, and such if something as horrific and awful as this were to happen? What would you do? What could you have in place? Could you have phone trees in place for notification? Could you have weapons in place, maybe even body armor, whatever the case may be? Could you keep a go bag or a bug out bag in your vehicle or at work? Could you keep armor at work? Could you do all of these things? I'm not urging or endorsing that any of my listeners do this, and I suspect that there is a large proportion of my listeners who have not only engaged in these kind of thought experiments and engaging in what these worst case scenarios are, but I'll bet a lot of them not only have the tools, but have taken the time to make sure that they and their families and their friend networks are acquainted with how to use the tools properly to defend themselves. Because we have 19,000 police agencies from the local to the federal level in the United States. Let that burn in your mind. 19,000. But there are 3 Supreme Court cases, among others, Warren versus D.C., for instance, that tell you that the police have no legal obligation whatsoever to protect individual citizens. Now, obviously, this is there for very practical reasons. Constitutionally, if somebody is injured and the police were either nearby or weren't there, could one sue the police department because of Warren versus D.C. and a number of others and say, hey, why didn't they protect me? Obviously, practically speaking, that can't be done. It simply can't be done. But it also calls into question that if these Supreme Court arguments and settled jurisprudence say that the police aren't there to protect you, 19,000 departments, by the way, if they're not there to protect you, then any means by which one tries to constrain individual private gun ownership sort of breaks that social contract, where on the one hand they're saying, hey, we're not going to protect you, but number 2, if you attempt to protect yourself in certain areas of the country, you will be subject to the harshest penalties as a result of attempting to protect yourself. For instance, and I would love to have listeners confirm this and see if my numbers are off, but I'm going to call it 1 to 5%. 1 to 5% of Israelis before October 6, 2023, had firearms. I don't know if they had access to pistols or rifles, but I was told by folks I trust that you could have a pistol, you could have 50 rounds, and then once a year, maybe you can get some more. And that very few Israelis had privately possessed firearms. Now, mind you, we see all of these pictures, especially of buxom Israeli women, most in uniform, where they're at the beach or they're at a shopping mall, and they've got their AR slung around them, whatever the case may be. Those folks happen to be maybe in the IDF reserves, in the IDF active service, or they're doing their service tour, and they're authorized to do that. Private citizens, October 6th and before 2023, in Israel, weren't permitted to do that very thing. They couldn't have private firearms there. I think it's wacky. I sort of know why that's the case, because when you look at Labor and Likud, we are talking about left of center and left of center, and Israel has always been a left of center government. So left of center governments, with very few exceptions, tend not to embrace or endorse or allow private weapons ownership. And you may not know this, but 94% of all land in Israel is owned by the government. Again, they do this for practical and constitutional reasons, so that a very wealthy Islamic oil state can't come in there and buy up all the private property, and for other reasons. But of course, that comes with all the concomitant malfeasance and mischief and nonsense of having the government have the ownership of the land, and what happens as a result of that, and how that sort of warps and woofs the relationship between the people and the government. I think they have tried to ameliorate that problem by either loosening or eliminating a lot of the private firearms restrictions in Israel. I don't know. Maybe I have listeners who are more savvy on that, and if you can get in touch with me and let me know what's going on that front, that'd be very interesting. But in the end, when you think of this from an atomistic perspective, a perspective down at the person level and the people level and the small groups of people level, the very best way to defeat this current third front opening problem set in the United States is the vast and steep dispersal of privately owned firearms that people actually carry to nip these things in the bud when they do occur. So my sad forecast is that we have a better than an even chance of something like this happening, at least in one state, if not at a regional level, and at the outside probability happening in a synchronized, coordinated, and apparently spontaneous attack across the United States proper. Since I am assuming the government will not do the proper thing in this case, and we're not talking about administrations, I'm talking about the nature of government itself, I would urge all of my listeners to do your very best to remember that the only person or number of persons who is going to be there to take care of you is you. You're going to be your own, so get the tools, get the training, and for God's sake, contemplate worst-case scenarios and make the appropriate plans. So that concludes this episode, probably one of my more sad and dour episodes in the history of Chasing Ghosts in a Regular Warfare podcast. I hope in the future to make ones that are a little lighter, maybe not. As you're aware, as I mentioned, I talked about, I actually wrote a fictional short story, as it were, in my first issuance of The Dispatch, which is my interregnum fortnightly essay series on Chasing Ghosts in a Regular Warfare podcast on Substack, where I talked about this very thing. You can go there, and maybe that can dovetail with the things that I've talked about here. And I would love to hear from my listeners your perspectives, your recommendations, things that you may be hearing in the grapevine, but please don't ignore the possibility of something as awful as this occurring. So if you wish to get in touch with me, cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. I have a Chasing Ghosts Substack. Look for Chasing Ghosts in a Regular Warfare podcast, Substack, and you'll be able to find it. I publish notes on occasion, sort of if I can on a daily basis, which is sort of a real short form of commentary on something that's happened, where I'll publish it on my Substack. So it's not only my podcast episodes are there and my dispatch episodes, my dispatch writing is going to be on there, but on occasion I'm bloviating in a short form notes section because I've stepped back from Gab and Twitter because I found them to be such time vampires that they were really pushing me away from finishing projects or being able to engage in deeper focus of reading than I usually do. So I'm sort of in a detox phase with that. I wanted to thank you all for your loyal listenership. If you get the opportunity to leave a review on this on your favorite podcast venue, I would be ever grateful for you doing that. This is Bill, out.